Hello everyone, my name is Putty, and welcome back for another episode of LPs in Review. This is a series where I take a game that I've LP'd, and concisely sum up what I thought about it, put it through the ringer, and talk about things in a more scripted and organised manner. So today we're talking about Red Dead Redemption, which was released in 2010 for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. It was developed mainly by Rockstar San Diego, who were responsible for Red Dead Revolver, the first game in the series. This showed that Rockstar was prepared to put a team on the game that knew of the quirks and the culture behind the original. But there was some assistance from Rockstar North, who were principally responsible for the Grand Theft Auto series. So as you can see, there's a lot of influence from Red Dead Revolver and Grand Theft Auto in this game. The game is an open world third-person shooter. It's a typical Rockstar travel and quest system, and it also has a very similar engine to GTA 4. It is very much based in a Wild West theme. The gameplay is very smooth and enjoyable. It's very similar to the other Rockstar games. The addition of horses to the travel makes that very enjoyable and a little bit unique in comparison to the other games. A lot of the other games are often very, I'd say unrealistic in terms of how people mostly drive. It's a lot of fun, sometimes it can be smooth, but in my opinion it takes away from the immersion of the game. And something this game does very well is it immerses you in the world better than any Rockstar game I've played. I love the immersion that the gameplay gives you. It definitely makes you feel like you're part of this Wild West kind of setting, and I think it definitely immerses you better than many games ever, really. I don't think there's many games that do it much better than Red Dead Redemption. I think it's a fantastically immersive game, and that's definitely one of its strengths. It does have a large variety of weapons, and they're often very interesting to use. I think for a third-person shooter, it's reasonable. There are more interesting weapons in third-person shooters, though, and the weapons aren't that different from one another. I would compare this to Gears of War, which I haven't played much of, but already, with the limited experience with that game I have, the shooting's better. The shooting's more interesting, there's better mechanics there. It's not subpar, it's an average, mediocre third-person shooter. But it's smooth, it's very comfortable, and at times it is enjoyable. The cover system makes things a little easier. Again, it's very immersive, but it's not that interesting. What I like about it is not every quest involves shooting people, not every quest involves just going and being involved with a battle. A lot of quests are to do with traveling, to do with talking to people, playing poker. There's so much variety to the quests that the gameplay doesn't even seem that bad. The gameplay in the shooting is quite mediocre, but the fact that they vary up the quests so much, I think that's when the game starts to get a little bit more interesting. The design... Let's talk about the design of this game. The world is very nicely done. It fits in very nicely with the Wild West theme. The world is beautiful. It is one of the best worlds that I have seen on the 7th generation consoles. It is still, and it's 4 years old now, almost, well, in a couple of months' time. We'd say about 3.5 years old. It is beautiful. It is fantastic. It rivals some games we have today, if not better than some games we have today. It is a fantastic looking game. It has some relatively high resolution textures. It has a great stylistic look to it, and it absolutely captures the Wild West theme. I think it is extremely important to the immersion that this game looks as good as it does. That sunset you will not beat in many games. That sunset is absolutely beautiful, and it is fantastic use of what are relatively weak machines. It's brilliant. The design I can't pick a flaw with the design of this game. Now to talk about sound. The gun sounds are above average. They're not top class. They're not satisfying, and they're not as satisfying and enjoyable as some other games. But they are satisfying enough, and I think it definitely adds to the gameplay that the gun sounds feel relatively realistic, and they're very satisfying to listen to, and that's enjoyable. The voice acting is hit or miss. There is some top class voice acting from some of the main characters, but the comic relief characters sound a little bit off. This adds to the game in some ways, as the comic relief characters are tragically funny and pathetic, but at the same time, the voice acting isn't fantastic at all points in the game, and although it does add to the atmosphere of the game, it can break immersion on occasion. Where I think the game's audio shines is the music. The music is alright throughout the game. It isn't fantastic, but it's got some good backing tracks. Where it really shines is the music, the licensed music that they play at certain points during the story, and it really adds to the atmosphere. There are certain songs that really hit you. All the songs get your mood exactly right, and it just adds to the atmosphere of the location. I think I'm not going to be able to play any of those sounds for you in this video because of copyright issues, but what I will say is there are links in the description to a few of the points during the LP that the music played, and you can click on those and I think you'll get what I'm talking about. I think it's fantastic how the music plays during this game. It's top class and it's brilliant. Let's talk about characters, shall we? The main character is superb. He is my favorite Rockstar main character of all time. He's very relatable, and he's always shown as strong and reliable. Despite his tragic past, whenever his tragedy comes up, he's still shown as strong. He's never shown as weak. Despite tragedy, despite relatability, he's never shown as too weak, which is I think a flaw that a lot of games have, where once you start bringing in tragedy and relatability into your main character, you start to show him as too weak, too dependable. This guy, John Marston, is absolutely a strong-willed, independent character who stays like that throughout the entire game, and he has a dark side. This is something that a lot of games, a lot of shooters, I think, go wrong, is if you're trying to tell an engaging and important story and you're trying to make the player care and like the main character, you can't go having them go off on killing sprees. And that's something that this game does nicely. It lets you go off on killing sprees, it makes you go off on killing sprees sometimes, but it explains that this character, this isn't the good guy here. The main character is not the good guy. He's not a guy you want to root for. He's got this dark side. He's on the border, morally ambiguous, perhaps even evil. And it explains that, yeah, this guy is doing things for the right causes. You get to see that. You get to see that this guy wants to do good, but his methods, because it's all he's got, it's what his history has forced him into, his methods aren't exactly the best, and the game doesn't try and hide that. The game says, listen, this guy, what he's doing is not right. He's got this dark side. He's an outlaw. He's not someone that you want to be, but he's there, and you understand what he has to do. And I think that's important, that it's not something where you're like, this guy is not enjoying killing all these people. This guy is just somebody who has to do it, and I think that's important to the story's integrity. Some of the supporting characters are top class, absolutely incredible. I would list Wes Dickens and Landon Ricketts as some of the best supporting characters in Rockstar Games history. They are superb, and they make the game, and the story especially, so much more interesting. Alright, down to Puddy's specialty, the story. This is going to be a rather hot topic, because I think it's this story, in my head, I always go back and forth, because the thing is that the main premise at the start of the game is pretty generic, and at the start you don't have much emotional attachment to the story. This is because it's generally like, oh, I've got to hunt this guy down, I'm listing up help for it, Wild West. It gets you immersed in the game, but you don't really care that much about the story. It's when you get to the second act where things start to pick up a little bit. You don't have an emotional attachment to the story, but I think the Mexican story is genuinely interesting, because I believe that what's going on, the political battles, the characters there, they entice you into the story, and I think it's fantastic how interesting that story is, and I think that's important. I think that the second act story is interesting, and then when you get to the third act, that's when you start to have the emotional attachment, and I think they do that pretty damn well. You've been given a reason to care, so you're invested in the game, you start to care what happens to the characters during the third act, and I think the way they've told the story is fine. They've done that very well. The second and third acts, their storytelling is great. I think the story is very fitting to the theme of the world, and as we approach the end of the game, it really explores the modernization of the Wild West, which I think is a very interesting theme. In both countries, it brings up the topic of modernization and a changing of era, and very much makes us relate to people who are left behind in a previous era. I think it's a very interesting way of telling a story, and it does make us care about characters. There's emotions going in there. Unfortunately though, it only really shows you a set of moral questions. It's enticing you with hundreds upon hundreds of moral questions, but it doesn't really give you the chance to answer them. In fact, it doesn't even answer them themselves. There's never any closure to any of these moral questions. There's closure there, but I think it's the type of closure where you're like, well, was that right or was that wrong? And I don't think there's any interaction with these not hundreds, but of these many moral questions the game throws at you. It presents many themes in terms of moral questions, but doesn't let you interact. And I think it's more of Rockstar giving you a probably inaccurate history lesson and making you feel sorry for a certain group of lost characters, rather than letting you interact with this time period. It feels like you're separated from the game, and I think it's different from a series like Ace Attorney, where you feel in with these characters, but by the end of Red Dead you just feel like, I'm watching a movie. And I don't know how to explain it well, because I believe that it's very similar with graphic novel type games, but I think with this game in particular, the amount of questions it lays out on the table, the amount of interaction it gives you, I feel like it's a false pretense. And as much as you love to interact with this story, feel a part of this story, you're just always being told that there's no answer. And although, yeah, there is probably no answer, in the games that do moral ambiguity right, they let you answer that question yourself, rather than just saying, yeah, there's no answer. And I think that is the problem with the story of this game. So summing up, I think the story premise is good, and I think the actual gameplay is good enough to keep you interested throughout, but I still think there is too much of a lack of interaction with the story. The world is fantastic, and the traveling mechanics are interesting enough to keep you exploring for the hours of gameplay you will get out of the game. I think the mechanics are solid enough, the story is solid enough, and the voice acting is engaging enough to get you through 20 to 30 hours of gameplay, but only just. And that is where the game really falls down. There is enough there, but you always feel like you could get bored at any minute. It's a good and solid game, but it is not fantastic. I'll give this game a 7 out of 10.